Atane kanyak tu lang neli kikau kuat kata manaktot iliwit ki kamanaktotin nalungit chotin hibunik rakput nalungin yakap ko atane ukuat iling ng kailit kita. Waptik kun hulyo kapta iliwit kamanaktotin isumakrap tingnik isoak toamik pekpang nak toamik atane ay chokalit kiptigut uvlupak. Inuit humilya ka hawaw taray kabut atane iliwit ikayo halit kiptigut isoatun hawaw taray huklut. Iliwit ki tap ko aptaok nalungin niya ritin unayak tilakrak putik pakrapak nalungin niya kapko. Ilaya kalo kapta nagalunin hunalaka pigalo man nunapting ni iliwit muna kanya kaptigut kuyak parliwit sigut uvlupak ahin muna kaliwit sumaptigut uwane katemaroni ilokata kihupayak ay makawing mikalo. Diyos sa tingagun apiripin. Amen.
Please be seated. Good afternoon, colleagues. Please join me in thanking Elder Lillian Elias for leading us in prayer today. Thank you. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the wildfires and flooding impacting our communities across the territory. If you or your community has been impacted by the fires south of the lake or by the flooding in my riding, please know that our thoughts are with you all. If you are impacted, I encourage you to work with local emergency officials. I want to personally thank the leaders and staff people who have been working tirelessly to help the affected residents. If you have not been impacted, but you want to help those who are, I encourage you to make donations and reach out to those who are providing assistance. As Northerners, we help each other when and how we can. We are here for each other. Colleagues, we have not been together in this house since March 30th, 2023, and I am pleased to welcome you back. It's great to be here. Although we have not met in this house in nearly 2 months, I know you have all been busy in our communities. Our committees, have met numerous times and have traveled and discussed legislation with residents. Cabinet members have been busy with the ongoing operations of government. Each of us has been occupied with the needs of our constituents, the people who elected us and whom we represent in this chamber. Colleagues, I hope you are also able to find time to connect with your family and closest friends, the people who support us as we work for the people of the territory. Springtime in the Northwest Territories is a beautiful time. The days are getting longer, the birds have returned from the south, and the waterways are opening up. I know a lot of you and your constituents have been out on the land taking part in the spring hunt. I wish everybody success and safety on the land. And I hope you get a good tan like I did over the spring. Colleagues, please join me in welcoming our pages to the chamber. It is an honor to share this space with our youth. Not only are we welcoming youth into this chamber as pages for this sitting, but we also recently hosted our 19th Youth Parliament. It was inspiring to hear our youth read their statements and debate motions in this chamber. Our Youth Parliament is a wonderful program that I am very proud of, and I want to thank the staff who made this successful again this year. I have said many times that I believe our youth are our future. Based on what I've seen and heard during our youth parliament, I am confident our future is in good hands. I would also like to welcome our interpreters back to the Assembly and thank them for their work. Our language are vital to us as Northerners. They tie us to our culture and to the land and to one another. Our interpreters make it possible for us to use, strengthen, and honor our languages. During this sitting, I am honored that we will be able to provide interpretation into the following languages: Dene Sulaneyate, N.W.T, Dene Kede, Dene Jate, Klicho Yate, French. Now, colleagues, it is my duty to advise the House that I have received the following message from the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. It reads, Dear Mrs. Speaker, I wish to advise that I recommend to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories the passage of Supplementary Appropriations Act, Infrastructure Expenditure Number 2, 2023-2024, and Supplementary Appropriations Act, Operation Expenditure Number 1, 2023-2024. During the second session of the 19th Legislative Assembly. Yours truly, Margaret M. Tom, Commissioner. Thank you, colleagues. Minister statements. Minister statements. Deputy Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on behalf of the Premier to announce 2 new government policies on how the Government of the Northwest Territories supports residents who have been evacuated from their communities for extended periods of time and communities that support them. As of May 24th, nearly 2,000 people from Hay River and the N.W.T First Nation Reserve has registered as evacuees in Yellowknife, with additional evacuees staying in other N.W.T communities, including Enterprise, Fort Providence, Fort Simpson, and Fort Smith. Currently, residents who must evacuate their home community receive transportation, meals, and accommodation at the evacuation centers. Income assistance clients are also provided emergency funds of $500 to $1,000. However, we know that not everyone is eligible for support through income assistance, and being away from home can result in unexpected expenses that are particularly challenging for those who experience an interruption to their income. Today, the Government of the Northwest Territories is launching 2 new programs to support registered evacuees and community governments: the Evacuee Income Disruption Support Program and the Community Government Hosting Evacuees Grant. The Evacuees Income Disruption Support Program assists individuals who have lost income due to recent community evacuations. This program aims to provide targeted financial relief during evacuations. The Income Assistance Disruption Support Program is available to all N.W.T residents who are subjected to evacuation order over 7 days and have suffered loss of income because of their employment has been disrupted due to the evacuation order. Eligible individuals will receive a one-time payment of $750. With yesterday's announcement from the town of Hay River, many evacuees are now planning to return home. Still, I assure those residents that if their income has been disrupted, they will still be eligible for this program, even if they returned home. Information on how to apply is available on our website and on the N.W.T Facebook page. Mr. Speaker, it's also important to note that we support our community governments at this time, most notably the town of Hay River, the N.W.T First Nation, and the communities that have welcomed residents since the evacuation orders were issued on May the 14th. We understand that some evacuees have chosen not to come to Yellowknife for a variety of reasons, and were being supported by other communities in the South Slave and the Dehcho. We commend these communities for taking in, feeding, supporting evacuees during such a challenging period. In order to assist communities who have been unable to secure funding from other sources, the N.W.T is launching the Community Government Hosting Evacuees Grant, which is a grant designed to help eligible community governments cover costs associated with supporting registered evacuees, including staffing, lodging, meals, and the provision of essential services. Municipal and Community Affairs Minister Shane Thompson has already sent letters to relevant communities advising them of this funding, which is separate from what is provided to communities operating official evacuee centres. Communities seeking the Community Government Hosting Evacuee Grant will have up to 30 days from the date of the evacuation order is lifted and/or community residents are available to return home to apply for this grant through the program. We announced both programs today, and more information is available for residents and community governments on the N.W.T website or our N.W.T Facebook page. We know this wildfire season is going to be challenging. The evacuation event for Hay River and N.W.T First Nation serves as a reminder to all of us to do everything we can to be ready for emergencies, include being prepared for evacuation on short notice, and wherever possible, having plans in place to safeguard personal health and safety, as well as economic well-being, and your families, members, and pets as well, Mr. Speaker. This is exceptionally challenging period for many N.W.T residents, and we must continue to lean on each other in the days and weeks ahead. N.W.T residents and community have this government's full support. The N.W.T is incredibly grateful to the communities and the residents of Yellowknife who have welcomed so many evacuees with open arms and open hearts. I also want to thank everyone involved in supporting evacuees at the multiplex here in Yellowknife and in Enterprise, Fort Providence, Fort Simpson, and Fort Smith, as well as any other communities that have welcomed evacuees. Your compassion and time have not gone unnoticed. Further, on May 18th, the N.W.T announced it's committed to supporting fire evacuees from Hay River and N.W.T First Nation through a donation matching program through the United Way N.W.T. The N.W.T is matching donations up to $150,000, providing critical assistance to those affected by the ongoing community evacuations. 100% of donations raised through United Way N.W.T 2023's wildfire response fundraising campaign will go towards supporting evacuees. The community and corporate support we've seen for this campaign has been truly inspiring, and I want to thank the donors for their generosity. On behalf of the Government of the Northwest Territories, I want to give our heartfelt thanks to the crews on the ground, the pilots, the air attack officers, and tanker-based teams for their incredible support to combat these wildfires. Queen Aini, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, today I want to extend my continued sympathy to the families of two men who gave so much to our territory and also highlighted how our government will be honoring their memory for years to come. I'm of course speaking about the loss of exceptional two men, former Housing Minister Alfred Moses and former Housing N.W.T President CEO Mr. Tom Williams. I have carried their memory in this portfolio, advancing our relationship with Indigenous governments, and most importantly, working directly with our communities. It is because of their leadership and support that we have been able to take the National Housing Strategy and convert it into successful relationships and funding for housing in the Northwest Territories. During the 19th Legislative Assembly, examples in this government include individual partnership agreements with Indigenous governments for housing, as well as direct funding from Canada to Indigenous governments for housing-related infrastructure projects. I'm pleased to be a part of this success in this relationship and all relationships throughout the Northwest Territories that open the door for housing and N.W.T to be successful in the Northwest Territories. I'm still saddened by the passing of Alfred Moses and Tom Williams, and during the time of this government, in respect of their work and accomplishments for this government and this portfolio, today I would like to announce scholarships in both their names. The two new scholarships that Housing N.W.T has recently introduced, the Alfred Moses Memorial Scholarship and the Tom Williams Memorial Scholarship, to recognize and celebrate students who have provided positive contributions to housing programs across the territory. These scholarships are in memory of Alfred and Tom, who demonstrate a profound commitment to addressing housing issues throughout the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, Housing N.W.T will offer 6 scholarships of $1,000 in the name of Alfred Moses and 6 scholarships in the name of Tom Williams. Both scholarships will award one in each of the 5 Housing N.W.T districts and one in Yellowknife, are available to students who are entering into the field related to housing. Applications will be open. The closing date is July 5th of this year. Housing N.W.T already strongly supports the development of apprenticeships, which was a huge commitment of Mr. Williams in the maintenance and trades, and these new scholarships will provide additional support to widen our workforce and students to become interested as they complete post-secondary and secondary education programs. Mr. Speaker, as we previously shared with the members of the Legislative Assembly, we will work with the Department of Education, Culture and Employment to promote and coordinate Housing N.W.T's apprenticeship program to secure additional candidates throughout the territory. Housing has a targeted 12 local housing organization apprenticeships positions every year. Mr. Speaker, Housing N.W.T understands that investing into our youth means a better future for our residents. Our values include innovation, stability, and collaboration. With the introduction of these scholarships, we are expanding our support to many students and apprenticeships across the Northwest Territories. We believe this will help strengthen our workforce with the more skilled workers and leads to a brighter future for housing solutions. Mr. Speaker, Alfred Moses and Tom Williams have made a lasting impression on my life. As being a first member-elect, it was saddened to see and hear the passing of these two individuals as I entered into my political career. Today, I'd like to welcome Pam Williams, the wife of Tom, and their son, Aurora and James. I'd just like to express my sympathy to the family as well, too. Your dad was a very great mentor and a strong colleague of mine. Must seat, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to advise the House that the Honourable Shane Thompson will be absent from the House for today and tomorrow to attend a federal, provincial, territorial Minister for Conservation, Wildlife and Biodiversity meeting in Ottawa, Ontario. I also wish to advise the House that the Honourable Caroline Cochrane will be absent from the House for today and tomorrow due to illness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today with the permission of Frank Grubin's mother, Laura, I'd like to speak to everybody here and throughout the Northwest Territories and beyond to tell you about Frank, who has been in Fort Smith attending college and was last seen on May 6, 2023. Frank is 30 years old from Aklavik. Frank is Inuvialuit and Gwich'in. He has a beautiful blended culture and is passionate about his traditional values he learned throughout his life. Frank loves learning and speaking the Gwich'in language. He had the most fun on the local radio station with his mentor, Elder Annie Buckle. He also taught Gwich'in to the children of the Aklavik Jordan's Principal program. Frank has a beautiful smile that captures anyone's heart. His smile could light up any room, and he could make you laugh from your tummy with his silly gestures and his acting behavior. Frank loves taking care of his appearance with all his brand name clothing, always looking sharp the way he dresses. Frank is a kind-hearted young man and is willing to help anyone who needs it or asks for help. Frank loves his elders, especially his grandmother, Renee Stewart. Frank is such an inspiration to his baby sister, Kimberlyn. She adores her big brother, and he loves her so much. Frank is also a big brother to Stephen, and they both love to cook and try new recipes, challenging one another. Frank has so many friends who are all posting their memories and stories of their best friend, asking for answers to bring him home. So many are heartbroken. Many tears have fallen since he has gone missing. The people of Acknowledgements, friends, family, especially his parents Laura and Charlie, brother Stephen, and especially his little sister Kimberlyn, are asking to help bring Frank home, please. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to bring awareness of who Frank is, make a face, and turn him into a person for the rest of the territory and the rest of the world. Frank is an Indigenous man of the LGBTQ community. And when I heard of the statement released by the RCMP yesterday of no evidence of foul play, it shook me to my core. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Mr. Speaker, if there is no foul play, then where is he? He wouldn't just disappear. Something has happened to him, and somebody knows something. Mr. Speaker, Frank's mother told me RCMP, and what she felt is that they are not doing enough to find him. Mr. Speaker, it makes me think of all the work that we have done to raise awareness of MMIWG, 2S LGBTQIA, and the inquiry and this House and the work that we've been doing as Indigenous people to raise awareness. If Frank was a non-Indigenous person from a wealthy family, would there be more done? That's what goes to my mind, Mr. Speaker. Would there be more to find him? Would there be animals, search animals that the RCMP can have throughout? You see it on TV in the rest of Canada. Would they be out there searching for Frank? My understanding, the RCMP has no tips from the public on Frank's disappearance. So on behalf of his family, please, if anyone has any information, no matter how small or unimportant they think it might be, to tell the RCMP, to reach out to Crime Stoppers, even if they're scared and want to do it anonymously, to 1-800-222-8477. What if this was your son? What if this is your brother, your cousin, your nephew, your grandson? His family needs to find him, and they need to bring him home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member. Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, today I'm going to speak about the state of internet connectivity in the N.W.T. and lack thereof. Mr. Speaker, 2 months ago, the Auditor General of Canada released a report titled Connectivity in Rural and Remote Areas, which stated that rural and remote communities are still lagging behind the rest of the country when it comes to internet. The report also stated that the N.W.T. has the largest disparity of internet access in the country, with only 18% in small N.W.T. communities that have access to high-speed internet. In comparison, 98% of people in larger N.W.T. communities have access to high-speed internet. Mr. Speaker, this large disparity in internet connectivity for the people of the N.W.T. is not acceptable. Our government needs to work at a faster pace with the federal government, along with the private industry, to bolster internet access across the board if the N.W.T. hopes to meet the federal government's goal of providing 100% of Canadians with access to high-speed internet by 2030. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, CRTC, has held a series of public hearings over the last year to receive consultations on the status of telecommunication services in the far north. During the last couple of hearings, there are several N.W.T. witnesses who provided some great ideas for the CRTC and internet service providers to consider. For example, one person rightly stated that it's mostly Indigenous people who don't have access to internet services. And as a result of internet service delivery should be considered within the text of reconciliation. I agree with that because increasing access to high-speed internet will work to advance economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples and communities. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, another big issue on this subject is the lack of competition of internet service providers in the North. In the N.W.T, we have a monopoly over internet delivery from Northwest-Tel. Without some degree of competition, prices remain high, and the speed of internet continues to remain low as well. In fact, Northwest-Tel itself has admitted that increased competition in recent years from Starlink satellite service has motivated them to expand and improve their own internet access. Northwest-Tel admitted that it has lost some customers to Starlink already, which is pushing them to expand fiber optic lines in more northern communities, which is great to see. Mr. Speaker, I go on about this, but I will leave it at that for now. I will have questions for the Minister of Finance at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I welcome you and my colleagues back for another productive session. I rise today to give thanks to all the hardworking and dedicated people who have spent the last few weeks fighting fires in the South Slave, dealing with the flooding in the Beaufort Delta, and supporting evacuees barely 1 year after they coped with the devastating floods. My heart breaks for the people of the Katladiche First Nation. Not only did they suffer from the flooding last year, with some of them still not in their homes, but now they've also lost significant infrastructure in their community, the extent of which is not yet fully known. Thankfully, I hear several historical and cultural artifacts were spared, items that are irreplaceable. However, people have lost their homes. We can never replace the mementos and the photos, the family heirlooms passed down from generation to generation. And for that, I am truly sorry. This has been a hugely stressful time for all residents across the territory. We are a small community. We all have loved ones, friends, and family that have been impacted by the recent emergencies. Emergencies that are only increasing in frequency as the Earth's climate continues to change. Storms that once only occurred every 100 years are now coming more regularly. And we must figure out how to adapt if we hope to survive. One thing about Northerners is that we are resilient and we are strong. Do I like that we're constantly challenged by the environment around us? No. But what it has done is given us the ability to persevere when the going gets tough. And it is that perseverance that will help us to adapt to the change around us. Mr. Speaker, we must stop being reactive to disasters and start to plan more accordingly. The N.W.T has a dismal track record in this area, choosing to wait until it's too late and the emergency has begun. The Minister of MACA has told me that his department doesn't have the capacity to deal with emergency situations or project management, as it's a very small department. That is the responsibility of the underfunded communities to prepare and deal with climate change-driven disaster. A scary thought, Mr. Speaker, given the lack of resources and money in most communities. Mr. Speaker, when is this government going to get proactive and stop leaving our communities to pay out of pocket for situations created by lack of adequate funding or investment in our communities? I would have had questions for the ECC Minister, but he's chosen not to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. In December 2019, I called on this Cabinet to declare climate emergency. I tabled a draft motion that got resistance from Cabinet. What's happened since? I confess I gave up on a motion with the COVID pandemic, which seems to have overtaken everything we do as a government. However, there are now over 650 Canadian governments that have made a climate emergency declaration, including the federal, territorial, provincial, municipal, and Indigenous governments. This government's climate emergency failures and lack of leadership has got me going again. On April 1st, 2023, the Premier finally fulfilled one of her leadership campaign promises to change the name of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. That's great, but it doesn't get this cabinet off the hook from an astoundingly bad track record on the climate emergency. Look no further than this so-called establishment policy for this new department that the Premier signed off on. The definition of climate change doesn't even acknowledge that climate change is the result of human activities. The new department is charged with helping us to understand and adapt to climate change. There's nothing about mitigation or complying with national and international commitments and targets. This policy is so weak, it doesn't even incorporate the Statement of Environmental Values or state that climate change presents a crisis or an emergency situation for the Northwest Territories. Maybe Cabinet hasn't been paying enough attention during the recent unprecedented floods, fires, and extreme weather events. In fact, during my more than 7 years in this Assembly, I've only ever heard one senior government official use the words climate crisis or climate emergency. Only once, Mr. Speaker, not from this Cabinet or any of its ministers. It's all about using these events to leverage federal money for infrastructure, for adaptation, rather than doing anything about mitigation or changing our business as usual trajectory. This government is on a clear path of failure to achieve its commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This government doesn't even acknowledge that our carbon tax is a tool to help with those reductions, as there is nothing to link the climate emergency to a carbon tax in that legislation. I'll have questions for the Deputy Minister on Cabinet's climate emergency failures later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member Statements. Member Statements. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Sunday, May 14th will go down as the day the residents of N.W.T First Nations will never forget. That is the day a fire was started by unknown sources close to the old village and the new site of N.W.T. By late afternoon, the fire gained momentum and grew by the minute. That for the safety of KFN residents, they were evacuated across the river to Hay River. Mr. Speaker, that fire became known as the KFN fire. The month of May has always been considered as having moderate temperatures, but this spring was like no other, as we were facing very dry conditions and a heat wave. So dry, even a spark could ignite a fire. Mr. Speaker, this spring, the residents of KFN were spared from a major flood, as in all previous years, in which they were evacuated to points beyond, including the YELLOWKNIFE multiplex. It is with heavy hearts we had to hear of another catastrophe faced by the N.W.T First Nations residents. Heavy hearts, as they were still dealing with the effects of last year's major flood and the ongoing remediation work to many homes. Mr. Speaker, the major KFN fire affected the town of Hay River as evacuation orders were issued for both the town and KFN. Residents were scattered to Enterprise, Fort Resolution, Fort Providence, Fort Smith, Fort Simpson, and Yellowknife in the N.W.T. Many other residents went south to stay with family and friends. Many residents were put up in hotels and available buildings where they were available, cots, couches, and what have you, to provide as much comfort as possible during these difficult times. Mr. Speaker, many of the evacuated residents are very thankful for everyone opening their doors to them and providing meals and hospitality. It always goes without saying that we should be helping our neighbors through their difficult times, as trying as the situations may be, to provide the necessities of life. Merci to all the communities involved and the numerous volunteers involved to assist in the KFN fire of 2023. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Member Statements. Member Statements. Member for Tunide Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Northwest Territories is renowned for its awe-inspiring landscapes, pristine wilderness, and warm hospitality. So no one should be surprised that our tourism industry has become a vital pillar of our economy and source of pride for our people. However, the same industry is now under grave threat by the suffocating excessive red tape, unreasonable demands from our own government. In recent years, the Northwest Territories has emerged as a sought-after destination for travelers from corners of all of the globe. Our remote lodges, tucked away in the heart of our nature, have been a haven for adventure seekers, nature enthusiasts, and those seeking a respite from a hustle and bustle of southern city life. They have provided not only employment opportunities for our residents, but also showcased the unique beauty and culture richness of our land. Yet, instead of nurturing and supporting these thriving industry, our government has chosen to burden it with a web of bureaucracy and obstacles. The excessive red tape imposed on remote lodges have reached on presidential level, stifling their growth and endangering their very existence. What was once a thriving industry, contributing significantly to our economy and fostering community development, now faces uncertain future. It is astonishing that these burdensome regulations have been thrust upon our tourism operators without any corresponding changes to the territorial regulations. Our hard-working lodge owners and operators find themselves caught in a web of ever-increasing demands, demanding tens of thousands of dollars of unnecessary expenses. This is a gross injustice as it places a burden on our entrepreneurs and jeopardizes their livelihood of countless families across the Northwest Territories. Our government must be reminded of our duty to support and promote our own local business, not to suffocate them with unreasonable demands and standards. We demand transparency and accountability from our elected officials. They must provide a valid justification for these excessive regulations and explain why they are necessary to maintain the safety and integrity of our tourism industry. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my member statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunadewelde. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude a statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, colleagues. I'm calling upon the Minister of ITI to work with her colleagues to reevaluate their approach and support the hardworking lodge owners and operators who have poured their blood, sweat, and tears into creating a unique experience of our visitors. Their dedication, passion, and unwavering commitment have brought the wonders of our land to the world. We need a government that fosters an environment conducive to growth and innovation, not the ones that stiffen it. We cannot allow excessive red tape to strangle our tourism industry and rob us of our opportunities that it brings. It is time that our government respects the needs of our tourism operators while ensuring the safety and satisfaction of our visitors with a fair and supportive environment for our tourism industry. I would have the questions for the appropriate minister at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tunadewelde. Member statements. Member for Mumphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my member statement is regarding the Corporate Registries Division of the Department of Justice. Mr. Speaker, first of all, I would like to compliment the Department of Justice Corporate Registries Division for the accessibility of information of all societies registered in the N.W.T. Each society's constitution, financial statements, and list of directors' information is available to all simply by accessing the information for a modest fee. However, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to corporation, the access to important information is not available. The ownership of each privately held registered in the N.W.T. is hidden from the public. The province of Alberta and other jurisdictions have made ownership disclosure mandatory for all registered private corporations. The N.W.T. should do the same. Mr. Speaker, currently we have many unknown companies operating in the N.W.T. Many do not bother to obtain local community government business license. We have concerns about some of the business practice of these companies. If they do not pay their bills, how can we follow up? We would like to know who these companies are and who owns these corporations. Mr. Speaker, I will have a question for the Minister of Justice at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphrey. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I grow increasingly concerned that the procurement review is never going to end, Mr. Speaker. And I don't mean in a good way, that we'll continually review our policy and make sure we are improving procurement for the residents. I mean that we will never actually complete it and change the policies that define N.W.T procurement. And this isn't just a suspicion, Mr. Speaker. In the N.W.T's own work plan, they say by the end of this Assembly, they will identify potential policy mechanisms to support enhanced Indigenous procurement. Mr. Speaker, what this should read is that we will create an Indigenous procurement policy with set out targets by the end of this Assembly. I do not know whether we will have an Indigenous procurement policy in this Assembly or the next, Mr. Speaker. I do not know whether our P3 policy will be amended. I do not know whether we will create a consolidated purchasing policy as recommended by the procurement review. We say we are going to finally make changes to the definition of a northern business in the business incentive policy by the end of this government, Mr. Speaker. Well, time is ticking to get that policy through cabinet approvals. I have not seen that, Mr. Speaker, so certainly not enough time for regular MLA's feedback. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, there was recommendations for targets for negotiated contracts. There was recommendations that the N.W.T consider its approach to leasing. I have repeatedly asked in this House to change the leasing of improved real property policy from 1998, Mr. Speaker, and what I'm told is that we have to wait for the procurement review to be done. Yet the procurement review work plan makes absolutely no mention of leasing. So why am I being told that that has to be done when it's not doing anything to do with leasing, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, at this point, this government has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on procurement, all while talking about how we're going to improve procurement, but not actually changing the policies. These are executive-level policies. They take time to get through cabinet. I get that, but let's get them done before this Assembly is done and put a bow on procurement so we can end this review once and for all. I'll have questions for the Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I rise in the House to pay respects to the constituents who passed since our last sitting. You know, Mr. Speaker, when I bring their names up in the House, their names will never be forgotten because it's in Hansard. And the history in the history books of N.W.T for all my constituents in Nunavut. I just want to pay my respects to the deceased Harley Sam Tudjuk Adam, young baby, son of Jeffrey Adam, Susie Tudjuk of Tuktoyaktuk. Harley survived by his parents, his grandparents, and many siblings and relatives. Edith Tootsie Lute, daughter of Eddie and Alice Grubin of Tuktoyaktuk, survived by her children Erica, Ariel, Bobby, Lute, Alyssa, Alicia, and Alice, and many grandchildren and sisters and relatives. Billy Panuktaluk of Tuktoyaktuk, son of Bob and Mabel Panuktaluk, survived by partner Barbara Panuktaluk, daughter Lynette Panuktaluk, and many brothers and sisters and grandchildren and relatives. Buddy Grubin of Tuktoyaktuk, son of Charlie and Persis Grubin, survived by daughter Heavenly Gloria Elias and grandchildren, his brothers and sisters and relatives, and he will be sadly missed, and a lot of good hunting with Buddy when I was younger. Catherine Kadigarigok, daughter of Richard and Winnie Kadigarigok, survived by son Gilbert, and many family, friends and relatives. Alison Raddy, passed of Tuck. Her brother or sister Betty, survived by sister Betty, Leslie, Tony and Vincent. In Inuvik, my uncle Scott Kusuk, to all the family, thoughts and prayers are with you all. And whoever lost loved ones across the Delta, across the Northwest Territories, thoughts and prayers are with you all. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family and communities at this time. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've had the privilege of listening to N.W.T. youth speak about mental health, addiction, access to sport, climate change, reclaiming language, family violence, living in care, and the piece that links so much of this, housing. 1/5 of Canadians experiencing homelessness are youth between 13 and 24. More youth experiencing homelessness identify as male, Indigenous, and a significant number identify as 2SL GBTQIPA+. Youth experiencing homelessness are 6 times more likely to be victimized, and nearly every youth that spoke to social development on homelessness prevention was or is involved with Child and Family Services and has experienced homelessness. Every single one. In the N.W.T, youth age out of care at 23, which is higher than other Canadian jurisdictions. However, increasing the age without support still leaves youth vulnerable to experiencing or being at risk of homelessness. Youth aging out of care may not be prepared or ready to live independently. And in addition, youth and all residents are faced with serious housing barriers. In many communities, there are 0% vacancy rates for affordable housing. In addition, a lack of resources and high costs of living leave youth vulnerable to homelessness. Other jurisdictions are preparing youth by developing legislation to support their transition from care, allowing youth who have exited care to re-enter, funding transitional housing, and providing youth with self-advocacy resources in the transition process. As the government finalizes its homelessness strategy, this government needs to prioritize youth and youth aging out of care. The homelessness strategy does not make commitments to prevent or reduce homelessness experienced by Indigenous youth in care and does not address creating safe spaces for 2SL GBTQIPA+ youth. These were both recommendations social development included in its review of Child and Family Services, neither of which received adequate response. This territory needs to stop perpetuating the cycle of discharging youth and children involved in Child and Family Services to homelessness. These youth need preventative supports and wraparound services. The N.W.T needs legislation making the provision of suitable housing for youth leaving care mandatory. The GNWT must immediately give Child and Family Services the staffing and resource development capacity to proactively keep youth from from homelessness, like self-advocacy toolkits, accessible websites with working links to support this. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? If there are no nays, you may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleagues. Entering adulthood, Mr. Speaker, seems harder than ever these days. Youth transitioning out of care need the GNWT to immediately give Child and Family Services the people and resource development capacity to proactively keep youth leaving care from homelessness. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's no place like home. And I think that the residents of Hay River know that as well as anyone. For the second year in a row, the entire community of Hay River as well as KFN have been evacuated in the middle of the night. And finally today, the majority of residents of Hay River can go back to the community, and I'm sure many of them are on the road right now. I'm sure many of them were on the road yesterday. Unfortunately, our neighbors, our friends, our family, our co-workers at KFN, they don't have that same luxury, and so our hearts go out to them. I want to take this opportunity to thank a lot of people. And I might miss some, but my intention is really to thank everyone. It is a big deal when 2 entire communities evacuate and they have to go somewhere. So a lot of people have to help. And first and foremost, I want to thank those fighting the fires on both sides of the river. We have over 150 wildfire firefighters working on it. We have the structural firefighters in Hay River patrolling that side of the river. We have a number of first responders in there doing their part, and they've been working full out for the past 10 days. So we're so appreciative of their efforts. Because of those efforts, The fire that damaged KFN and is threatening Hay River is now been downgraded to being held from out of control. And Mr. Speaker, from what I've heard, the comments from firefighters who've been around for 50 years and those who are brand new, they have a lot of, I guess, respect for this fire. I mean, it's big, it's powerful, there's a lot of fuel out there for this fire, and so while it may be being held now, it is still threatening. So I want to make sure that even though we are allowed to go home, we are going home, the residents are prepared to leave on a moment's notice if they need to, because that fire, it's only 6 kilometers away from my community. That's a few hours if the winds shift. So it can come back. So I want to make sure everyone has their gas tank full and a bag packed. I want to thank all the communities, the individuals and the businesses that opened up their arms to the residents of Hay River. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Hay River North. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude a statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
It's no small feat to house and feed 4,000 people, and that's exactly what happened. I want to thank the staff and the volunteers who are providing support at all of the evacuation centers. I want to thank everyone who's made donations. I want to thank all of my colleagues here as well. Every time I had to call one of my cabinet colleagues, they answered the phone. A number of the regular members have reached out, offered their support. So personally, I want to thank them as well. Mr. Speaker, this is the 2nd year in a row that this has happened now. For those of us living on Vail Island, I believe it's the 4th year in a row we've had to evacuate. Residents were scattered all across the Northwest Territories, Alberta, some went to British Columbia, I'm sure there's some elsewhere. I was here in Yellowknife, and I spent my days at the evacuation center speaking with constituents and residents of KFN, and I want them to know that I did listen. I heard what they had to say, and I relayed those messages to Cabinet every single day. They talked about their accommodations, they talked about their safety at the evacuation center, they talked about challenges housing their pets, they talked about their finances and the challenges, affording to evacuate. And so I did bring those to the ministers every single day, and I want to thank Cabinet for coming forward with a new evacuee financial support program, the first time that's ever been done in the territory. So that's very much appreciated. It's not going to make anyone whole. Not everyone's going to be eligible, but it will help many of those in need. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that this was a tough one. There was a different feeling this year from last year when we evacuated from the flood, and that's because we are still recovering from the flood. We're recovering from a number of drug poisonings. There's been an explosion in Hay River. It's been a tough year. People are stretched financially, emotionally, and nerves really are frayed. So I know yesterday when we got word we could go home, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. We got to relax our shoulders a little bit, and you could see it walking around town. There was a different mood. So I just want to make sure everyone who is home stays safe and is prepared in case the worst happens again. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay River North. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Minister responsible for education, culture, and employment.
Mr. Speaker, I have a return to oral question asked by N.W.T Twin Lakes on February 13th, 2023, regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on education. The question is, what is known about high school attendance rates through COVID-19, the attendance rates in small communities versus regional centers, and Indigenous students' attendance? The Department of Education, Culture and Employment, or ECE, has publicly shared attendance data for 2020-2021 through the JK-12 Performance Measures Report. In the 2020-2021 school year, many students returned to school only on a part-time basis, and a few schools experienced closures due to COVID-19 public health orders announced by the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer. The Northwest Territories school system was able to adjust the collection of attendance data to capture remote learning. However, the effects of the pandemic impacted and continue to impact the ability to compare current attendance rates to pre-pandemic rates. Additionally, attendance rates for 2019-2020 school year only reflect the portion of the school year that included face-to-face and in-class instruction. From September 2nd, 2019 to March 13th, 2020, prior to the school closing. As a result, data for the 2019-2020 and 2020-2021 school years remains incomparable to previous school years. ECE publishes attendance data by grade, education body, and community type, but not ethnicity. Further detail regarding the 2020-2021 attendance data can be found on pages 47 to 49 of the JK-12 Performance Measures Report. Overall, attendance in the N.W.T. for the 2020-2021 school year was 79.9%. In Yellowknife, it was 85.3%. In regional centers, 75.5%. And in small communities, 76.3%. The 2021-2022 attendance data is currently being verified and will be included in the JK-12 Performance Measures Report for 2021-2022, which is tentatively scheduled for release in June 2023. In October 2022, ECE released the COVID-19 Impact Indicators Report. This report examined available data on the effects of COVID-19 on the N.W.T. JK-12 education system. The report found that attendance was difficult to properly maintain in 2019-2020 through to the 2021-2022 school period, and that inferences from this time are therefore difficult to make. ECE will continue to collect, analyze, and report on data related to the impacts of COVID-19 to better understand the pandemic's effect on education and improve student outcomes. Question: does the department identify and support students to complete their high school education that did not graduate and are ineligible for post-secondary studies? Once students have entered high school, they begin taking courses and earning credits towards graduation. A total of 100 credits are currently needed to graduate. Although there are generalities around the order in which students take courses, there are no strict rules around courses and years. As such, students can continue to take high school courses year after year until they complete the 100 required credits for graduation. For some students, this can take only 2 years, and for others, it can take upwards of 5 years. The Career and Education Advising, or CEA program, exists in schools to assist grade 9 to 12 students through a career exploration process. The CEA program supports them in making career or education development and transition choices and accomplishing related tasks, such as work experience, career, post-secondary or other training, and community living. There are 8 career and education advisors, with 3 based in the Yellowknife region, 1 in the South Slave, 1 in the Decho, 1 in the Tlicho, and 1 in the Satu, and 1 in the Beaufort Delta. Full funding is available for students up to 21 years of age, with partial funding available for students older than 21 years of age to continue taking courses in high school. Students can choose to leave high school before graduating, but they are never removed from high school for not meeting graduation requirements. If a student contacts the department or the district education council, support will be provided so long as they are under the age of 21. If they are older than 21, individuals are able to seek supports through Aurora College's community learning centers. Question: is there a funding cap through the SFA program for students who might need multiple years of university prep? The Student Financial Assistance, or SFA program, offers full and part-time assistance to Northwest Territories residents attending accredited post-secondary programs at an approved post-secondary institution. The SFA program supports eligible students who attend the Aurora College Occupations and College Access Program, or OCAP, and the University and College Access Program, or UCAP. There is no funding cap for students who access OCAP or UCAP. As long as the students remain eligible, they are able to access SFA funding for these programs. While the SFA program offers assistance to students enrolled in OCAP or UCAP at Aurora College, the program does not provide assistance to students enrolled in other academic upgrading at Aurora College or any post-secondary institution. ECE has completed the SFA program review and is proposing changes that will help to reduce the barriers students face in pursuing post-secondary education, such as removing all semester limits for Northern Indigenous students and expanding remissible loans to all N.W.T. residents. ECE believes these changes will better support students who need additional time to complete their post-secondary studies, including more time completing prep. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize Jamie Linnington, the Interim General Manager of the Tucho Cooperative and President of the Freshwater Fish Harvesters Association, which is a newly incorporated entity that is looking to transform the national entity into a harvester-led one. Jamie is also an intergenerational Métis fisher owner-operator and is unfortunately one of the evacuees from Hay River, which was good news for me because I got to catch up with her in person. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to acknowledge 3 St. Patrick High School students who are Frame Lake residents serving as pages in this sitting. Ava Maurice, Denis Lockhart, and Kyla Simba. Merci, and Marcy, and thank you.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to recognize 2 constituents from the Sawtoo. I'd like to recognize Ms. Sierra McDonald, who is working here with us in the Legislative Assembly, and she's just completing her political science degree. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Robin Doctor from the Sawtoo as well, too. He's celebrating 14 years with the N.W.T. and is actually works for Department of Infrastructure. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Sawtoo. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Colleagues, I'd like to recognize Pam Williams, also Aurora and James. So James must have stepped out, but I see this spring both Pam and James went to the Islanders game, which was Tom's favorite team, and looked like he had an enjoyable time. It's a privilege to have you all in the house today, and you know Tom was a good friend to many of us and dearly missed. Thoughts and prayers are with you all. And if we have missed anyone in the gallery today, welcome to the chamber, and I hope you are enjoying the proceedings. It is always nice to have people in a public gallery. Thank you. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the start of this assembly, there was a lot of talk about Indigenous procurement policy, and then the feds, they stepped up and they created some targets for Indigenous procurement, and as well as the Yukon, and we kind of seem to fall apart on that. And now our plan says we're going to identify some potential solutions and maybe get this work done. I'm actually a little confused whether we will have a clear Indigenous procurement policy in the life of this government. So my questions for the Minister of Finance is, where are we at in regards to creating an Indigenous procurement policy? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we don't need to do things the way Yukon or the federal government do. I know the Yukon process wasn't necessarily greeted with 100% pleasantness from the members around, from the Indigenous governments in the Northwest in the Yukon, nor from their businesses. Where we are on this one, Mr. Speaker, Indigenous procurement policy has gone to the Northwest Territories Council of Leaders and our modern treaty and self-government tables. This is where it belongs. These are the groups that are going to be impacted. These are groups that need to have a voice and need to have a role in developing this policy. So we're taking this through that process. They've already met with officials. It's already on the agenda for the upcoming Council of Leaders meeting. The work is already moving forward in terms of developing the internal process that they'll be using to look through what steps they need to take to define an Indigenous business and define a Northern Indigenous business, and how we can work through ensuring that any policy we apply is in line and respectful of the treaty obligations that we have to modern treaty holders and their economic chapters. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not putting a deadline on this. The intention was never to force through a policy and to place it down on Indigenous businesses or Indigenous governments. It really is to work with them, and that work is now well underway. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I worry that this is going to get caught in negotiations, and hopefully by the next Assembly we'll have an Indigenous procurement policy. But I'm hoping for a clearer yes on the business incentive policy. The work plan is pretty clear that in the life of this government, we are going to revise the definition of a northern resident and we are going to increase BIP thresholds for tenders and RFPs. Can the minister provide us an update about whether that work to finish the BIP review and amend the BIP policy will be done in the life of this assembly? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, Mr. Speaker, as I had previously said, the work is well underway and will be delivered in the life of this Assembly. There will be a change to the definition. We're going to be getting rid of the need for a Schedule 3 and getting back to focusing on what the objectives of the BIP really are, which is around investment in the Northwest Territories, encouraging investment, encouraging business growth here in the Northwest Territories, and supporting businesses that support that objective. That definition, as I've said, so it is on its way. It will be here in the life of the Assembly, and the member will have plenty of opportunity to ask me questions about it before the August session. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah.
Yellowknife North, yes, sorry. Get stuck there.
No more water.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During the procurement review, there was a couple sections on leasing, and the procurement review panel said that the N.W.T should look into whether there was a different approach to leasing, and then the Department of Infrastructure kind of took that as we can't do any work until the procurement review is done. But I don't actually believe the procurement review is changing anything with leasing. I could be mistaken. But can the minister let me know whether there is any intention to change any of our leasing policies related to procurement in the life of this government? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, leasing does fall a little bit out of the wheelhouse for me in the Department of Finance, but certainly in terms of understanding what's happening as a whole of government, Infrastructure and the Department of the Executive do confirm that they do want to look together at the improved real property policy. They do want to do that once the formal procurement processes for government procurement and public procurement are done, but also in line with the Indigenous procurement policy that I had just described a few moments ago. So that work will be underway once that is complete. It's important to, again, we want to be integrated in the approach here, and we don't want to develop this policy around leasing knowing that there's Indigenous development corporations and Indigenous businesses that are interested in this area until the Indigenous procurement policy work is done. Mr. Speaker, what I suggest is we can certainly add this to our work plan in this area so that there's a clearer timeline and a clearer sense of the work that's happening. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I get that perhaps the desire to negotiate an Indigenous procurement policy, which could potentially affect all areas of procurement, has paused some of that other work. I guess perhaps a review of a new work plan that clearly will go on beyond the life of this Assembly of what is being done and when would be helpful. There were some recommendations about the negotiated contracts policy in the procurement review. Some are small, some are larger about setting targets, some are about reporting. I'm a little confused what's being done there or whether that also is completely dependent on first finishing a negotiation on an Indigenous procurement policy. So can the minister tell me whether any changes to the negotiated contracts policy will occur in this government's term? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are indeed some guideline changes coming through the Department of EIA to support more clarity around the negotiated contracts policy, but really the challenges here are, as I think the member is pointing out, negotiated contracts policy is right now being used in place of an Indigenous procurement policy to really look at how we are supporting and helping grow Indigenous businesses in the Northwest Territories. So the Indigenous procurement policy really is what is going to be the focal point here. With guidelines, as I've mentioned nonetheless in the interim, to help make the negotiated contracts policy more clear. But as far as what we've done here, Mr. Speaker, the Department of Finance does have an improvement already in terms of our overall reporting. There's contracts reporting, there's an online dashboard, there's a lot more online information about how we procure, what's being procured and where. And importantly, Mr. Speaker, vendor performance management has already rolled out, continues to be enhanced, and is at a stage of ensuring that there's actual enforcement around vendor performance management. If we're at a point where we can enforce the contracts and enforce the expectations we have on businesses to be hiring locally, procuring locally, that is going to be addressing the needs of our local businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in April during the CRTC public hearings on telecommunication services in the far north, your Deputy Minister of Finance testified. In his testimony, he stated that Indigenous households have an internet take-up of only 63% compared to 94% of other households. Can the Finance Minister expand on that point and tell us where the statistic came from and what her thoughts are on those public hearings from CRTC? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha, Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's a lot there, and I think our submission to the CRTC was around 70 pages or so. So let me try to sum up. The statistics of the 63 versus 94 comes from the Northern Canada Internet Use Survey, NCIUS, and that's done by Statistics Canada. This one was from 2021. And Mr. Speaker, I would say the public hearings were productive. One very discrete and specific outcome was we saw that Northwest Tel, in fact, agreed with a proposal that we've been advocating for, both with the federal government and publicly, around the Connecting Families 2.0 initiative. This is an opportunity where it bridges a digital divide. It's something the Government of Canada keeps telling me is available and yet hasn't been available to residents in the Northwest Territories because we needed an internet service provider to actually participate. So we were pleased that, having raised it yet again, it does seem that we've finally been heard and Northwest Tel will be participating in that program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, overall, there's a lack of competition with internet service providers in the N.W.T. Does the minister agree that having more options of internet services for the N.W.T. residents will help reduce the household costs of internet and also bolster the speed of internet in the long term? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, having more competition certainly is one way traditionally and historically that improves affordability in a marketplace. It does, of course, rely on there being the infrastructure to provide the options to the market, and that is still an area where we are challenged here in the Northwest Territories. All that said, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what we've been expressing at CRTC for some time, trying to balance between the fact that we need significant investments to support infrastructure in a marketplace that wouldn't necessarily have the customers to actually then offset the high costs of the infrastructure, at the same time wanting to get services into the hands of residents and be affordable and available. So one of the reforms we've put forward is reforms to the wholesale access provisions within the Northwest Territories, Mr. Speaker, that are controlled by the CRTC, with the hope that does help find that balance between encouraging and allowing for infrastructure development at a high cost, while also ensuring that there's a greater affordability for residents. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain what the government of the Northwest Territories has done over the course of the 19th Assembly to address the issue of internet disparity between the small communities and regional centres within the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the things I've certainly advocated to counterparts in the federal government now, several of them indeed, has been exactly on this issue that we face, where we not only have a lack of infrastructure to deliver the services, we then have a lack of affordability and we have a lack of redundancy, which for us in the Northwest Territories isn't just a luxury. It means that when one line gets cut, entire communities go without services for significant periods of time. We've suggested ways that the federal government could change their subsidy programs, could change their funding programs, but we've also worked with communities to try to ensure that they are able to apply where applicable to these different funding criteria. And I'll look to the example in the Cleat-Show with the N.W.T highway and the ability to support the Cleat-Show in terms of becoming an applicant. So we certainly are doing, I believe, our part to try to get that message out, to modify what we see. And in fact, the report that the member referenced earlier makes a lot of the same points, that the funding right now, as it's structured under the federal government, needs to be adapted to the needs of the North, needs to be adapted and modified to the needs of the North. And so we're pleased to see just the uptake of that message that we've had. Mr. Speaker, I certainly continue to advocate for all of these things. Again, we were happy to see that we're now part of the Families Subsidy Program, and opportunities like this, Mr. Speaker, to continue to bring forward around what other needs we have. Satellites is probably one of the next options. I'll stop there, Mr. Speaker, but that's another area where we're going to need to see some options given the delays coming out of Telesat with the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, does the minister agree that increasing access to high-speed internet will overall help to advance economic reconciliation for Indigenous peoples and communities within the N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for finance.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Absolutely, Mr. Speaker. Access to quality, available, affordable, reliable, competitive internet, telecommunications, absolutely, that increases economic reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, I could stop there, but this is an opportunity. I know there's times where our federal government counterparts are listening. I know they follow what we say. I hope the CRTC follows what we say here, because that is an absolute truth. We're trying to do our part. We need to have private sector involved. We need the federal governments to be involved. These are major investments, major infrastructure investments that are needed, not only to bring fiber, but where fiber is not feasible or realistic, to ensure that they have those satellite systems up and running, that we are notified well in advance when they're not, that to the extent that there are federal regulations around satellite provision, that they are keeping up to date with the realities on the ground. And Mr. Speaker, I think the right things are being said. The right things are hopefully going to be happening. The CRTC, while their formal hearing process is over, final submissions are not. So the opportunity to get our message out is not over, and we will continue to take that opportunity whenever it arises. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, as a mother of 2 children, I can't even imagine what Laura is going through with Frank missing. The feeling of not having any power, and to feel that the RCMP is not doing enough to find her son. So I'm asking the Minister of Justice to commit to contacting to the commanding officer of their Northwest Territories to ensure that the RCMP in Fort Smith have all the staff that they need, any missing persons expertise to continue the investigation to bring Frank home. Thank you.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Lakes. Minister responsible for justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, as everyone knows, I can't direct the RCMP, but I certainly can relay what is being said in the House. And I will say I did speak to the commanding officer about this prior to today, actually. And I know that he is concerned, the RCMP are concerned. I feel for the mother. This is unimaginable. This is every parent's nightmare. And so I think that if I was in the same position, I would also feel that people weren't doing enough. I can't imagine, Mr. Speaker, so my heart goes out. And I appreciate the member's statement as well, her call for people to get out or bring information forward. And I've had this discussion with other MLAs as well. There's rumors out on Facebook. There's lots of talk, but the RCMP needs information. There's someone who knows something. They need to come forward. They need to bring that information forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T. Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think the Northwest Territories is going through a lot right now, and I think the Minister is going through a lot right now in his own home community. And I think the Northwest Territories continues to be a reactive. We're always reacting to situations. And, we've worked hard in this government to bring the missing and murdered to life and to make actions and calls to actions. And I just want the Minister to follow up with the RCMP on their section of that Section 9 of the calls to action, because is there a way, is there a department that maybe the mother can go to make sure that the investigation is being done properly? And that's what these recommendations calls for, because Indigenous people throughout Canada have continuously been failed people don't take our word at face value. We don't, it just seems like we're not heard, and RCMP needs to hear us, and please, somebody help this mother bring her son home. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will certainly raise these issues with the RCMP. We, as the government, have been working on implementing our action plan, our response to the final report on the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. The Department of Justice has been working on a missing persons legislation. I was hoping to get it done this term, get it introduced, but it's taking longer than we had hoped. There's a bit more work to be done consulting with the RCMP, with other departments, as you know, it's a piece of legislation that impacts a lot of different departments and other pieces of legislation. So, like I said, this is unimaginable for the family. And as the member is correct, there's a lot going on in the territory. Dealing with the wildfires, and the floods, I'm always struck by the fact that life continues to go on. Despite these things that everyone's living through, life continues to go on, and we do need to recognize that people do have these struggles, and we do need to be responsive to them, not just reactive. So I take the member's point. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess my last question is it's this time of the year. The mother is concerned that there are fires close to that community. It is a time of the year where all the animals are coming out, and you know what? We don't want to think the worst, but the reality is we haven't seen him for a long time, and so is there within his department or any other department that there's funds available somehow to support the family, or more searches within the surrounding area of Fort Smith, and to, with the police and everything? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Municipal and Community Affairs does have funding. If a community government applies for that funding to initiate or support a search of an area, that is available, and it's my understanding that that has happened, and those funds have flowed to the town of Fort Smith to help support those efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Framley.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions are for the Deputy Premier. The establishment policy for the new Department of Environment and Climate Change came into effect on April 1st, 2023. Can the Deputy Premier tell us whether this government acknowledges that the current climate emergency is the result of human activities, and explain why that doesn't appear in the policy? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Framley. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories Climate Change Strategic Framework clearly acknowledges that the climate change is linked to human activities. The definition of climate change in the establishment policy is consistent with how climate change is defined in the Climate Change Strategic Framework, and its broadly accepted definition as well, Mr. Speaker. The establishment policy is intended to be high-level, overarching document that describes the work of the department. And it's important to note that the new department specifically has climate change in its name to reflect the significance of climate change action to the department and the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, I do want to note that the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment reviewed the draft establishment policy and provided feedback in February. Mr. Speaker, concerns about the definition of climate change were not raised at that time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Oral questions. Member for Framley.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I'm raising that concern right now, and it's not in the definition, but let's move on to the next question. Nowhere in the establishment policy it is acknowledged to recognize that climate change in the N.W.T is a crisis or an emergency. And I will tell the Minister that this was raised by Standing Committee. So can the Deputy Premier tell us whether this government considers climate change a crisis or an emergency for the Northwest Territories? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Climate change represents serious and urgent challenges for the Northwest Territories, and the N.W.T takes climate change action very seriously. Mr. Speaker, like, look at us now, we're dealing with wildfires and floods. So, I mean, this is very real to us. The climate change strategic framework, as well as the energy strategy, and their associated action plans are guiding the N.W.T's commitment to address climate change and its impact. The Legislative Assembly has advanced a number of climate change-related mandate items, including ensuring that all Executive Council and Financial Management Board decisions consider the context of climate change within all of their decisions. As I noted, Mr. Speaker, adding climate change to the name of the new Environment and Climate Change Department demonstrates the importance this government places on climate change action. Mr. Speaker, the government and the Premier Cochrane take climate change and impacts being felt in the North seriously. Like I said, she has spoken at length and great detail at recent events, particularly to a national audience about the severity of climate change in the North, as well as some of the impacts felt by some of the Northwest Territories residents, as well as our communities. This message is one that she is very passionate about trying to alert other Canadians the realities of climate change. Mr. Speaker, I was at one of the events where the Honourable Premier Cochrane had spoken about that, climate change is more active in the North. It is. I mean, we're seeing it on a yearly basis. So, I mean, this is a message that this government is doing to ensure that we are getting message out. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Oral questions, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Deputy Premier for that. I didn't hear the word crisis or emergency. I heard serious, but I didn't hear the right words. So I'm going to try it a different way, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned in my statement that I've only ever heard one senior person in this government ever use the word crisis or emergency next to the word climate. So can the Deputy Premier tell us whether the public service are allowed to call climate change a crisis or an emergency? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's no restrictions on public service related to the use of the term crisis or emergency. The way we communicate climate change to our residents is important, and the terminology we use ultimately plays a role in shaping public discussions. The N.W.T uses climate change generally in our communications because it is commonly accepted and understood by residents. Mr. Speaker, we recognize climate change is a highly political issue. So are the conscience of using the terminology that we could be dismissed or polarized by individuals who are holding very different views. Ultimately, there are a variety of factors, including audience engagement, political sensitivity, that shapes how this government communicates about complex issues, including climate change. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Final supplementary, member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I just wish that N.W.T would get on board and join one of the 650 other Canadian jurisdictions that have made a climate emergency declaration. But in all the debate and public statements I've seen from this government around a carbon tax, I don't ever recall it being clearly linked or described as a tool to fight the climate emergency. So can the Deputy Premier confirm that the real purpose of the N.W.T carbon tax is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I stand here as Deputy Premier, as well as wearing several minister roles, I also have the opportunity to be able to redirect this question to another minister that's able to provide more information on climate change and more specifically to the carbon tax issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to redirect to the Honourable Caroline Wozniak. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I am quite happy to confirm while the carbon tax itself remains for us, it's a commitment under the Pan-Canadian Framework of Clean Growth and Climate Change. That's the federal-based system, and that's why we have to continue to adapt ours. In the online annual report that is put out by the Department of Finance on carbon tax, in the message from the minister, it does quite clearly say, from me, the carbon tax is intended to encourage carbon conservation and the substitution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, Mr. Speaker, that's quite clear. There's a number of other. I took the chance to have a quick look at Hansard just to make sure I'm being very clear. And it is important that people realize no one likes paying more taxes, no one likes the carbon tax, but there is a reason behind it. I want to find solutions that will reduce carbon taxes in the North so that we have less reliance on fossil fuel use. That's the point of the carbon tax, is to get people off fossil fuels. And Mr. Speaker, again, I realize we all know that that's difficult in the North, but nevertheless, on another occasion, I had the chance to say, we don't want to be on fossil fuels. It is not helping the climate. It's expensive. It's not the way of the future. Fundamentally, this is what we need to do. So semantics or not, Mr. Speaker, we do need to find a pathway off of fossil fuels. And the last one, just to make sure that we're very clear, Mr. Speaker, I think is when we had some federal ministers visiting us here. We want them to see the lack of alternatives. If there's federal money, that it can start to come here so we get off fossil fuels. We need to do that for climate change reasons. We need to do that for the cost reasons, but we need to do it because it's the right thing to do. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tune-Day-Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, the Tsukay First Nation purchased the Frontier Lodge just outside their community. It's a lodge that will be able to provide employment and training and opportunities for the First Nation. And it's managed by Corey Myers, who is the general manager for Frontier Lodge. And already, as you know, the lodging industry here in the Northwest Territories is full swing right now. And I just want to mention that the lodge, Corey Myers received a letter from the Health and Social Services Department talking about the current water system they have is no longer acceptable by the N.W.T. Mr. Speaker, this is a concern to the Chief and Council in Tsukay, and I know Mr. Myers has been working diligently with the Minister of ITI, and they've been making some good progress in some areas, and they have a really good relationship. But right now, as it is, it's concerning now that the lodge is may be forced to either close if the system is not upgraded right away. And we need to take a look at the system, and we need to work together with Mr. Myers, Chief and Council, ITI, and the Health Minister, Ms. Julie Green there, and if we could work together in trying to figure this out so that some of these barriers we could work around and still provide employment and training to our people in our communities. And so anyways, I just want to maybe just ask some questions to the minister. Can the ITI minister tell me how many remote lodges were told that they must significantly upgrade their water treatment system before being granted essential operating permits? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister.
Thank you, Member for Tune-Day-Welde. Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to redirect the question to Minister Julie Green. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, water regulations are under the Department of Health and Social Services. It's my information that the Environmental Health Officer has been working with the Frontier Lodge to resolve the issues around permitting that have arisen, that this work has been ongoing for a year, and that what we're trying to achieve here is public safety, where we're not trying to put anyone out of business or to inconvenience. We actually regulate collaboratively, if you will, with the operator to ensure that it's a resolution that is feasible and practical. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde-Wilde.
Thank you, Mrs. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister, Health Minister Julie Green. I guess my question will be to her again now, I guess, is in terms of, can you also explain what have changed since last summer when Frontier Lodge was granted their food establishment permit that makes their existing water treatment system adequate now? That'd be the question to the Health Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunde-Wilde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the regulations haven't changed in more than a decade, but the information available about the water system has changed, and that's why we're on a different footing now than we were a year ago. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tunde-Wilde.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Mr. Speaker, other remote lodges continue to operate with their existing water treatment system. Can the Minister explain why Frontier is not being given the same opportunity? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Tunde-Wilde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's true that some small lodges are exempt from the water system regulations. However, Frontier is not a small lodge. It's more the size of Blatchford Lodge. And so the water system requirements are different for Frontier than they would be for a smaller lodge. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Tunde-Wilde.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister provide a reasonable explanation for the lack of consultation with remote lodges with no communication between her department and Health and Department to properly assess the impacts of these changes to regulations before Health and Social Services started enforcing new water treatment standards? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Tunde-Wilde, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the regulations themselves haven't changed, and the department is working with the operator to resolve the situation around the permits. And so I encourage the MLA to transmit that message to the operator. I certainly don't want to see them lose a season of business. I went there last year. I don't think the member was there, but I went there last year on a retreat, and it certainly is a very nice place to be, and I think that this is a problem that can be resolved so that others can enjoy it as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are about water, but in a different area. I am going to ask the ITI Minister about the fish plant. So given that we've heard a lot about the impacts to Hay River and the South Slave with the fires and the flooding, can the Minister speak to what is being done to support the fishers to ensure that there is enough production of fish to go through the plant and not make it a folly? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Great Slave, Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the fish revitalization strategy from back in 2017 speaks to these exact challenges. Unfortunately, rather than seeing production go up from the time of 2017, production has only continued to go down. We are nowhere near hitting our quota on the lake, and it certainly is going to impact the fish plant. There's no secrets to that, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we need to work with the fishers. We want to ensure that they know that we're working actively to make sure that we are not going to remain under FFMC forever. There's different pathways to get there, Mr. Speaker, and I've asked to make sure that we have one available and ready to go. We've been hoping the federal government would help us provide that path. It hasn't happened, so we're going to have to chart our own way through. In the meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, we continue to provide direct supports to the industry. There's shipping and freight supports. There's seed money to support having infrastructure available, new boats, etc., to support some of those costs. And Mr. Speaker, again, but really it's wanting to ensure that there's an entire commercial fish program, Mr. Speaker, that has different supports available to them. Perhaps I'll stop there, lest I go too long, but I do want to acknowledge that we certainly are aware of this and want to ensure that the commercial fish production, any subsidies are tied to ensuring that we're getting those production numbers up. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the minister being brief. There's been a lot of minister statements in QP today. My next question has to do with that support for the fishers. It's my understanding out of a recent meeting there is a long list of unmet obligations by the Department of ITI with respect to the fishers and the fish plant. So can the minister speak what is being done to meet those action items that were discussed with the fishers and ensuring that they have a healthy fishery? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was recently in Hay River. I attended there with the Deputy Minister and Assistant Deputy Minister. We sat down together with fishers and with representatives from the Tucho. It was, I believe, a very productive meeting, Mr. Speaker. It gave us the opportunity to have action items. Mr. Speaker, I think we need to want to be realistic. I know that the fishers have also been evacuated from their homes, from their communities, and from a critical time when they should be preparing to open the summer fishing season. That certainly has no doubt interrupted some of the back and forth necessary to move forward. But that said, Mr. Speaker, I know there are funds available that we were alerting our colleagues in Hay River to around training to ensure that they can bring new fishers on, mentors on, and we're going to work with those interested to see that those funds can be available, that they can apply. Normally this would be an application to ECNE. In the circumstances, Mr. Speaker, we're going to ensure that we can support people to have those applications done so that they're ready to hit the water. Mr. Speaker, I'm following on those action items myself. It's not been that long and there's been an evacuation, but as far as making sure that they're going to be moving forward, Mr. Speaker, that is why they are reduced down to an action item list that gets passed around between the parties. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Great Slave.
Not sure I would have called that answer brief, but I do appreciate the minister's response. Can the minister tell me whether or not she thinks it's appropriate for her staff to be going outside lines of communication and contacting fishers directly? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I don't know what the lines are of communication that look to have been breached, but Mr. Speaker, the job of officials in ITI is to be in direct contact with fishers all around the lake, and I would expect them to continue to be in contact with fishers all around the lake. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Great Slave.
I find that quite an interesting answer, Mr. Speaker, given that I've been CC'd on the correspondence between the minister and the fishers regarding this exact situation. There is a line of communication that comes from dealing with entities that have executive directors, that have managers, etc., and to go outside of that to other people within that organization to circumvent or undermine the leadership is inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. The minister needs to get her staff under control. I will leave it as a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. Give the minister opportunity to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a great deal of confidence in the staff of ITI. They are dedicated to the fish revitalization strategy. They are dedicated to the relationship they have with fishers and dedicated to the relationship they have with fishing organizations, including the Tucho and including the Fish Federation. So, Mr. Speaker, I will, on behalf of all the staff and the public servants who may have been listening just now, I do want to say that I have confidence in their skills. I want to encourage them to continue working in this industry, and all of us are going to be on the path to revitalizing the industry. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, I'd just like to remind you to respect the rules of the chamber. Thank you. Member State oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my original questions were geared for the MACA minister, and unfortunately, or fortunately for him, he's not in the House for the next couple of days. However, I do have questions for the housing minister. I understand there were several public housing units operated by Housing N.W.T. on the reserve, on KFN. All who had to evacuate. My question is, what arrangements were made to accommodate these evacuees to find suitable temporary accommodations in other communities? Merci.
Thank you, member for Decho. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for his question. We do work with the emergency management team as well. So with those evacuees for public housing on the N.W.T Reserve, they were encouraged to come here to Yellowknife to the emergency centres. And with that, we did follow up with the public housing tenants as well, and we're trying to find suitable accommodations for their return back to N.W.T. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. At the point of evacuation and the days leading afterwards, there was no messages or messaging to the public renters on available accommodations or what Housing N.W.T was going to do to accommodate finding them suitable units. And many were, handicapped, and many were elderly. And there was many women that were pregnant at that time. So I'm really wondering how Housing N.W.T missed that boat. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member as well. That I just want to really elaborate that we were dealing with an emergency for Hay River and N.W.T. I did work with the MACA minister as well, along with my colleagues, to look at how would we be responding, and how would the residents of Hay River be taken care of. They were encouraged to come here to Yellowknife, and further looking at their suitable accommodations here. Unfortunately, we didn't look at the available public housing units here in Yellowknife as well too, but we are working directly with those tenants as they return back to the community. We do have 10 federal housing units that are available in Hay River today. We are working with the community to look at the allocations of those units, and I will look at further updates for the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Decho.
Let's see, Mr. Speaker. What I'm getting at there is that the renters in the housing's public rental units on the reserve are the responsibility of Housing N.W.T in the Northwest Territories, and that go for any other community. And I'm wondering, why was there no provisions made to pay for accommodations like hotel rooms and their meals while they were temporarily removed from their public rental units? Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Once again, I really want to just really include that we are a part of emergency management throughout the Northwest Territories, and we respond as one government and supporting this initiative through MACA. Right now, we are in the conversation with the communities as well too, and looking at what are we going to be doing for housing replacements in N.W.T. Also looking at our affected clients, both in Hay River and N.W.T. We do have access to federal units right now, but we are looking at the ongoing conversation with the chief as well. What are we going to be doing, and how are we going to be responding? Are we going to be putting new units on the ground? Are we going to be looking at the federal units that are currently there? This is a further discussion that we are having at the community level. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Decho.
Merci, Mr. Speaker, and merci to the Minister for those answers. There have been about 4 of the public units that were burnt, and also 5 seniors' homes on the Beaver Road. I'm wondering what are the Housing N.W.T's plans to replace those units moving forward. Merci. Merci.
Thank you, Member for Decho. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are working directly with the emergency management and also with the with N.W.T as well, and looking at to finding further solutions to replace those units. There's actually 10 units that have been affected. I'm not too sure of the condition and if we've actually lost all of those units or if there's just severe damage to them. But as we go forward, I will provide those updates to the member. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit to following the best practices of other jurisdictions and ensure that the ownership of all privately held corporations is made known through access through the corporate registry search? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So corporate registries is publicly available. Anyone is able to search the corporate registries. It's a free search. For a fee of $4, anyone can then get detailed access to reveal who are the directors of that corporation, but the corporate registries does not keep a list of the shareholders of a corporation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The reason why I ask that is that because in the N.W.T. we have a good system in place, for societies. But when it comes to corporation for profit, we don't have any information. We don't know who owns what businesses, etc. And there's no requirements. And I just want to know why, So what is the purpose of keeping these information private? How do we ensure many of these business owners or these businesses are truly living and working in the N.W.T? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So corporate registries is responsible for extraterritorial registration, so companies from outside of the territory who want to do work in the territory, as well as corporations in the territory. So that information, like I said, it can be publicly found, the directors, the location of the office, so things like that are publicly available. If a municipality and Indigenous government is having difficulties, the Department of Justice is more than happy to help. If the member has a specific issue that she would like to raise, she can send me an email and we can, with some details, and we can discuss it. I might not be much help here on the floor right now. I don't have details of the concerns that she's raising. I'll say I'm not the most familiar with the Business Corporations Act. It's been a while since I've read it, and I'll say I have not read it in full. So it's difficult to sort of get perhaps the detailed answer that the member is looking for. But like I said, if they're running into roadblocks, we're happy to help. And so I encourage her to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I will take him up on his offer and meet with him to discuss this further. So no more comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Minister of Finance. Mr. Speaker, for the second year in a row, Hay River and N.W.T. First Nation residents have been hit with severe disasters and forced to evacuate, as we have heard much of today. Residents who work for the N.W.T. but can't work remotely are being asked to use vacation leave, special leave, or even leave without pay during this time. This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. Mandatory evacuation should not be made to take away from people's family and medical needs, mental health breaks, or vacation leave. The N.W.T. must reinstate leave banks to N.W.T. employees who evacuated from Hay River or N.W.T. First Nation. So I'm wondering if the minister can make that commitment here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister responsible for Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, emergency leave is available to public servants during an evacuation. This is paid leave. It does not draw down from other leave banks. And if an employee is being asked to take some other form of leave, Mr. Speaker, they should be discussing that with their supervisor or raising it in appropriate ways. If necessary, it can come through your MLA, it can come to me, but they should be on emergency leave with pay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I really appreciate the minister stating that, because I had the privilege of having dinner with people from Hay River last night, and this was not the information that they were receiving from their supervisors. So I think that that was really important information from the minister, and I appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the emergency leave that is afforded to public servants is equal to the number of days that they were under mandatory evacuation. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yes, if you're on emergency leave, if you're subject to an evacuation order, you can remain on emergency leave, and it won't draw down again, as I said, on your banks. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge there are public servants who are based within the community that's under evacuation who are working remotely, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm conscious of the fact that they are doing so under great strain when things are more than disruptive in their lives. So. Wanting to also extend that while these emergency leave banks are available, I certainly want to extend my appreciation for those that have been called to continue to work under circumstances that are very difficult, whether remote or otherwise. But certainly to be very clear, again, there are different types of leave, and even when the evacuation order is lifted, it may well be that some people cannot yet return to their homes or to their communities. There are those who can't return right now, maybe under health circumstances, back to Hay River in the circumstances. And again, they can be looking at what types of leave are appropriate, whether emergency leave is still appropriate or whether special leave or an annual leave is appropriate. But again, at that point, Mr. Speaker, once the evacuation order is fully lifted, that may change. But right now, if they can't go back, they should be speaking to a supervisor to ensure that they're being appropriately accommodated. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask that the minister also, and you know, the GNWT is very good at using Baranet. We even as MLAs get Baranet over here, and I'd like to ask that this information be added to an upcoming Baranet circulation as well. Mr. Speaker, GNWT employees are not the only NWT workers impacted by severe disasters. People who are self-employed or work for small and medium business who do not have billable hours or hours worked are going weeks without pay sometimes during these mandatory evacuations that are happening. We heard here earlier today from the Deputy Premier that the GNWT will provide $750 one-time payments to residents. When we look to the south and what's happening in Alberta, Alberta residents are receiving $1,250 per adult and $550 per dependent child when they go 7 days without mandatory evacuation. One of the concerns that I have is that there is such a high cost of living in the Northwest Territories, and quite often people are evacuated for a week at a time, and to expect residents to be able to pay their bills at even 1 week is 25% of your monthly income. So I'm wondering if, first off, if the minister is looking at raising that amount to something that is more reflective of the cost of living in the territory, and second, why they have that caveat of 7 days of evacuation, because missing even 1 or 2 days of pay is extreme for people in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Minister responsible for finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can't make everybody whole. The government of the Northwest Territories can't make everybody whole. I think several of my colleagues have already spoken about how heartbreaking this is. To hear on late Sunday night that this community was being evacuated yet again. Mr. Speaker, my first thoughts were to children who are being woken up in the middle of the night to have to leave their houses again. So, you know, it's not for lack of awareness of how tremendously difficult this must be, to the extent that someone who's not experiencing it can even pretend to actually be able to say that we know how someone feels when we're not in those shoes. So, Mr. Speaker, no relief program that we ever come out with is likely going to be one that is completely satisfactory, that makes anyone whole, and that totally fixes every single need that anyone has. I know that. I'm aware of it. If we're going to compare ourselves to Alberta, Alberta has some billion-dollar surplus. We do not have a surplus. We continue to run a deficit. We have an operating surplus that offsets some of the debt we take on for our capital plan. So that said, we're trying to find gaps. I know the United Way right now has over $500,000. They've been trying to get that money out the door. We're looking at ways that we can better support them going forward so that that process can be made more easy, that process can be more accessible. It's a nonprofit. I certainly don't want to put a burden on them, but there's a lot of money there that we want to be able to support them going forward, so we're having that conversation. And now we're looking at what other gaps we can fill. Again, Employees who are, we've looked at the number of employees that are under income assistance. They received their income assistance emergency funds and continue to receive income assistance. Looked at what the employment demographics are, who are N.W.T public servants, again, emphasizing they are on emergency leave. They don't have to draw down their banks. So trying to make do with the resources that we have, with the public dollars that we have available to us, to try to fill some